She entered the cafe as someone who crossed a space that had never required her permission, not out of explicit arrogance, but through the silent familiarity of someone who had always been served before asking. And the firm sound of her steps alone was enough to lift a few glances while others pretended not to notice, as if that presence carried an invisible weight that effortlessly reorganized the room. The place was simple, a constant smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread, tables set too close together, low conversations mixed with the clinking of cups, and yet something adjusted in the air. Because certain people don't need to speak to occupy the center, the space learns to revolve around them. The man had been there for some time, seated near the counter, a worn jacket carefully folded over the back of the chair and large hands wrapped around a small cup, as if he were holding not just the drink, but his own presence. He showed neither hurry nor expectation, only the look of someone accustomed to waiting, to not drawing attention, to existing in a contained way, and even the slight curve of his shoulders suggested someone who learned early that taking up less space reduces conflict. When he stood to join the line, he ordered a black coffee and a simple roll, voice low, words exact, and the attendant announced the price without surprise, as if that order were a predictable part of that man's routine and that world. That was when she, positioned right behind him, leaned slightly forward upon hearing the order. And the contrast between how little he asked for and how easily she moved in that environment sparked an immediate, almost automatic decision inside her. One that sounded like kindness in her own head. Before he could extend the money, she swiped her card and said, loud enough to be heard around them, that she would pay. And even without raising her voice, the sentence landed in the space like a public announcement. The man turned his head only as much as necessary, refusing with a minimal gesture, almost a silent plea for it not to happen. But the machine had already beeped, the payment was complete, and in that instant his refusal ceased to exist as a legitimate choice. He remained still for a second longer than normal, as if he needed to rearrange something inside himself, and then murmured a quiet, "Thank you," almost swallowed, not as relief, but as a defense mechanism, because in that context, gratitude wasn't kindness. It was protection. If you had been there just a few steps away, watching the approved card replace his will, would you call that thanks sincere gratitude, or would you notice it was merely the silent price of not being seen as ungrateful? The woman smiled, expecting something more, perhaps a look, perhaps explicit recognition. And when it didn't come, she filled the gap by commenting that she always helped when she could, that she believed those who have more should extend a hand, and some people around reacted with complicit smiles, validating the scene as a small moral spectacle. The man picked up the tray with excessive care and returned to his table, carrying not only the coffee and the bread, but a newly attached invisible label, while she remained near the counter, her body slightly angled toward the room, absorbing the silent approval. It was at that exact moment that, in the back of the cafe, a man who had gone unnoticed until then lifted his eyes from his own cup, discreet enough not to draw attention, attentive enough not to ignore what had just happened. He didn't react, didn't comment. He simply observed with a kind of silence that wasn't passivity, it was assessment. And when he straightened his posture and gently set his cup down, the cafe continued murmuring as before. But something there had already crossed an invisible line, and you could feel that the story was only beginning. The woman didn't walk away after paying as someone who closes a gesture. She stayed near the counter, her body subtly turned toward the center of the cafe, as if she were still on stage, and said in a clear voice that small acts of help change destinies. That sometimes all it takes is someone extending a hand for another to learn how to stand up. It wasn't a long speech, but it had the right tone to be heard, and the environment responded the way it usually does when someone offers a comfortable story. A man nodded. A young woman smiled while scrolling on her phone. Someone else murmured that good people still existed, and each of those reactions worked as silent reinforcement that the gesture wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. The man, already seated again, kept his eyes down, broke the bread into small pieces, and took a sip of the coffee that now carried a strange weight, not in taste, but in meaning. He felt eyes resting on him like a cold light that neither warms nor welcomes, only exposes, and realized that, without saying a word, he had been placed at the center of a narrative he didn't control. The woman continued, saying she did it because she believed helping was also a way of teaching values. And as she spoke, she looked around as someone confirming she was in the right place, saying the right words at the right time. Then she took it a step further, commenting that she hoped the gesture would be well used, that opportunities like that don't come every day. And by turning help into a public expectation, something shifted definitively. What had seemed like an isolated act now demanded a moral response, visible recognition, and if you were there, hearing that sentence right after seeing his refusal annulled, would you feel that demand was fair, or would you notice he was being invited to pay with submission for something he never asked for? His silence grew heavier, not from lack of thought, but because any word would now sound insufficient or wrong. Some people nodded again, others looked away, but no one challenged it, and that absence of opposition turned the entire cafe into an involuntary accomplice. The woman, noticing the expected reaction didn't come, commented that nowadays people don't know how to be grateful anymore, that kindness has become rare, and by saying that she pushed him even further into a public place he had never chosen to occupy. His silence began to be interpreted, measured, judged, and perhaps you recognize this kind of situation when help stops relieving and starts tightening, because accepting is no longer enough. You must perform. At that point, the scene stopped being about a paid coffee and became about moral hierarchy, about who speaks and who listens, who evaluates and who is evaluated. And a question arises right there, without abstraction or distance. When you witness someone being helped this way, do you feel comfortable with the implicit demand, or do you prefer to pretend you didn't notice to preserve the idea of intact kindness? The cafe continued functioning, cups being collected, orders being placed. But beneath that normalcy, there was a growing discomfort, because the help had become a stage, and when that happens, someone almost always has to be diminished so another can seem bigger. The man observing from the back didn't stand at the first silence or the second, because he had learned that certain interventions only work when the line has been clearly crossed. When there's no doubt, it's no longer a matter of interpretation, but of fact. He watched closely as the woman mentioned gratitude, noticed the rigidity in the seated man's body, saw how the environment accepted the demand without resistance, and only then did he push his chair back with a dry, low sound, enough to cut through the cafe's automatic flow. There was no drama in the gesture, only decision, and that detail made a few conversations instinctively stop, as if the place itself recognized that something different was about to happen. He walked calmly toward the center, not to impose himself physically, but to become impossible to ignore, and stopped at a respectful distance, not invading anyone's space, not touching anything. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and precisely for that reason it carried weight, because it wasn't fueled by emotion, but by clarity. He said he had observed the scene from the beginning, that he didn't usually interfere in other people's matters, but that something there had crossed a line that couldn't be treated as a detail, because at that point the help was no longer help. It was exposure, and the exposure hadn't been chosen by the man who was seated. The woman reacted with a tense smile, saying she was only doing good, that she saw no problem in helping someone in public. And perhaps you recognize that kind of defense, when intention is used as a shield to avoid any analysis of real impact. The man nodded slightly and replied that helping had never been the problem. The problem arises when help begins to demand moral return, when the gesture stops relieving a need and starts asserting a position. There was no direct accusation, no insult, just the precise naming of something that until then had been treated as normal. He then looked at the humble man and said that his silence didn't look like ingratitude, but restraint, and in that exact moment, The ethical authority of the scene shifted. What had been read as weakness was now understood as choice, and that shift was uncomfortable because it dismantled a comforting logic that those who receive must perform gratitude to legitimize those who give. The woman tried to interrupt, claiming no one was being humiliated, that it was all exaggerated, and that's when he delivered the sentence that reorganized everything, saying that the most efficient humiliation is the one disguised as virtue, because it needs neither violence nor harsh words, only silent applause. Some people immediately looked away, others hardened their expressions, because that sentence didn't accuse just the woman, it accused the entire environment. And perhaps you felt the same discomfort, the kind that arises when someone points out something you would rather not have seen. He added that he had been on both sides of that dynamic, that he had paid and had received, and that money changes circumstances, but should never redefine someone's dignity. By revealing simply that he was a Mexican businessman, accustomed to being underestimated because of his discretion and silence. He wasn't seeking status, only context, and the shock came precisely from that. The one who seemed distant was the only one willing to protect someone without gaining anything from it, without waiting for agreement. He concluded by saying that charity that needs to be seen ceases to be virtue and becomes an instrument, and calmly returned to his table, leaving behind a moral vacuum where automatic applause had been. The cafe fell silent for a few seconds, long enough not to be ignored. And if you found it counterintuitive that the one who didn't pay for the coffee was the only one to act with true ethics, perhaps that reveals how accustomed we are to confusing visible generosity with real character. And as the man sat down again, it became clear that his intervention wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something even more difficult. Because when truth changes voice, it demands consequence. The silence that followed wasn't neutral. It was shared weight, as if everyone there had been forced to recalculate their own position within the scene, and no one seemed comfortable with the result. The woman remained still for a few seconds, her body rigid, her eyes searching for support in faces that had previously validated her without effort, but now returned only neutrality or embarrassment. And perhaps you recognize that precise moment when intention can no longer sustain image. The cafe tried to resume its rhythm, cups being collected, orders being called, but something hung in the air. Because when a moral narrative is interrupted, the discomfort doesn't come from conflict. It comes from the clarity that remains. The humble man stayed seated, but something in him had changed, not in a way visible to a quick glance, but in how he occupied his own body. He finished the bread calmly, took a slow sip of coffee, and breathed deeply, not as someone preparing to attack, but as someone deciding he could no longer carry everything alone. Until then, silence had been his form of protection. But now he realized that the same silence could be used to conveniently retell the story, turning him into a grateful extra in a scene that had hurt him. Some people whispered, others pretended they hadn't seen anything, and that collective attempt at normalization made it clear that the greatest discomfort wasn't the mistake, but the impossibility of pretending nothing had happened. The woman stood and walked to the Mexican man's table, her posture less confident, her voice lower, saying she had felt exposed, that it hadn't been her intention to humiliate anyone, and in saying that, without realizing it, revealed that the center of the pain was still herself. He listened attentively, without interrupting, and replied that exposure isn't when someone points out who you are, but when what you do can no longer stand on its own. And that sentence wasn't meant to win a debate, only to return responsibility. She tried to argue that if it weren't for people like her, many wouldn't even have the basics. And it was at that exact moment that something inside the humble man stopped accepting silence as an option. He spoke softly, without haste, but with a firmness that reorganized the space around him, saying that the basics don't humiliate anyone, that what hurts is being publicly reminded of one's lack. There was no raised voice, no direct accusation, just the clear naming of something everyone there recognized, even if they preferred not to admit it. If you had been seated there, hearing that after watching help turn into demand, could you disagree without protecting yourself? The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath because that voice, until then invisible, now occupied the moral center of the scene, not by force, but by precision. The woman tried to respond, but couldn't find words because there was no attack to rebut, only a reality too simple to deny without violence. The humble man added that he didn't need applause or lessons, only respect, and in saying that, asked for nothing beyond what should have been obvious. He didn't raise his voice, but in that moment, it was as if he had, for the first time, occupied the space he had always been asked to shrink. And if you felt the urge to take a position now, to agree, disagree, or comment, perhaps it's because this turn doesn't allow neutrality, it demands choice, and the story was definitely not ready to end there. The Mexican man stood one last time without announcing the gesture, without clearing his throat, without seeking any kind of attention, as someone who understands that certain corrections aren't made with speeches, but with silent action. He walked to the counter while the entire cafe remained quiet in a different way, not out of automatic respect, but because everyone there knew, even if they didn't put it into words, that any sound at that moment would be inappropriate. He spoke quietly to the attendant, asked to settle all open tabs, and placed the necessary money on the counter, making it clear it wasn't to be commented on or thanked. And that detail, precisely that care not to turn the gesture into narrative, fell over the room with more weight than any sentence spoken before. As he turned to leave, he didn't seek the woman's eyes, didn't look for the humble man, didn't wait for any reaction. He simply adjusted his jacket and walked toward the door, and if you felt a strange tightness then, perhaps it's because you noticed the definitive contradiction of the scene. The one with the most power was the only one who didn't need to use it to assert himself. The one who could have placed himself above chose to disappear, and the one who seemed cold was the only one to act without demanding anything in return. The humble man stood shortly after, thanked only the attendant with the same low voice as always, but now without any weight, and left with firm steps, carrying with him something that was never for sale, his own dignity, while the woman remained seated, alone, staring at a coffee that no longer symbolized generosity. Only the exact moment she crossed a line, no one else was willing to pretend they hadn't seen. The cafe noise slowly returned, orders being called, cups being collected, conversations resumed in cautious tones, but nothing there returned exactly to where it had been, because that scene offered no easy villains or comfortable heroes, only a mirror that was hard to avoid. And it's here that the question rises directly from what just happened, without abstraction, without safe distance. When no one is watching, when there's no applause, when there's no pretty story to tell later, would you still help the same way? Because what was exposed there wasn't a payment. It was the need to be recognized for helping, and that completely changes the weight of any gesture. Situations like this happen every day, in cafes, lines, offices, buses, and ordinary streets, and they almost always pass without intervention, normalized by the silence of those who watch and the comfort of those who prefer not to get involved. If this story reminded you of a similar scene you've witnessed, of someone placed in a position of public gratitude, or even of a moment when you yourself confused help with superiority, perhaps it's worth not letting it simply pass. Sharing, commenting, taking a position is a way to break cycles that only continue because no one names them. And if you want to keep following stories that test moral limits, expose subtle injustices, and deliver reversals that restore dignity to those the world underestimates, subscribe now, because each new case is a new chance to see what usually goes unnoticed. In the end, it all comes down to a simple and difficult choice at the same time, one no one can make for you. Using what you have to show off or to preserve the other, turning help into a stage or into respectful silence. And the final image that remains is of one man who left owing nothing and another who left having demanded nothing. As it is written, before destruction, The heart of a man is haughty, but humility comes before honor.